Let me begin with a hard truth that many people do not want to hear. The loudest accusations often come from those who feel the most threatened by accountability. And today, accountability itself is on trial. For months now, my motives have been questioned, my actions dissected, and my role reframed as something far darker than it is. I have been called partisan, reckless, even unconstitutional. But what has been largely ignored, deliberately so, is the foundational principle that guided every decision I made. The law must apply consistently, even when it is inconvenient, even when it is politically dangerous, and even when the defendant once occupied the highest office in the land. This was never about personalities, it was never about elections, and it was never about vengeance. It was about whether the American experiment still means what it says, that power does not place one beyond scrutiny. I understand why this conversation makes people uncomfortable. The moment you bring law into proximity with political power, fear enters the room. Fear of destabilization, fear of precedent, fear that enforcing the law might itself fracture the system. But the greater danger has always been the opposite. What happens when we decide that certain people are simply too powerful to be questioned? Much has been made of timing, of urgency, of the claim that moving forward when we did was somehow an attempt to influence an election. That accusation misunderstands or intentionally distorts how the justice system functions. Investigations do not pause because a calendar page flips. Evidence does not become less real because a campaign is underway. And the obligation to act does not dissolve because the subject of an investigation announces political ambitions. To suggest otherwise is to argue that declaring candidacy should function as a form of legal immunity. That cannot be the standard in a constitutional republic. I am aware of the argument that prosecutorial discretion should yield to political stability. I have heard it before, many times in many forms. It is often framed as prudence, as restraint, as wisdom. But history shows us that this logic, when followed to its end, does not preserve democracy. It hollows it out. It creates a two-tiered system where ordinary citizens are governed by law and leaders are governed by calculation. Some have claimed that the very structure of my appointment represented an overreach, that a prosecutor operating with independence is somehow alien to constitutional design. But independence in prosecution is not a novelty. It is a safeguard. It exists precisely because political pressure is real, relentless, and corrosive. Without insulation, the justice system becomes an extension of whoever holds power at the moment. That insulation is not lawlessness. It is restraint by design. I have also heard the assertion that these cases represented an unprecedented intrusion into executive authority, that they criminalized core presidential functions. That claim deserves careful attention because if it were true, it would indeed be alarming. But it is not true. No office grants a license to obstruct lawful processes. No constitutional role includes the authority to retain sensitive national security materials outside legal bounds. And no interpretation of executive power allows for the disruption of the peaceful transfer of power. These are not abstract theories. They are concrete facts grounded in evidence, testimony, and law. There is a difference between respecting the presidency and shielding conduct from scrutiny. Confusing the two does lasting damage to both. What troubles me most is not criticism. Criticism is healthy. What troubles me is the normalization of the idea that enforcing the law is itself illegitimate when the subject is powerful enough. That idea, once accepted, does not stop at one individual. It becomes a rule, not an exception. And eventually, it consumes the system it claims to protect. I am not blind to the broader context. I know that public trust in institutions has eroded. I know that many Americans feel alienated, unheard, and cynical, and often for good reason. But dismantling accountability will not restore that trust. It will confirm the worst suspicions, that the system is rigged, that justice is selective, and that outcomes are negotiated rather than earned. Some have argued that these prosecutions energized political backlash, that they strengthened the very forces they sought to restrain, perhaps. But justice cannot be contingent on popularity. If enforcement decisions are dictated by fear of political consequences, then law becomes theater, a prop to be used or discarded depending on audience reaction. That is not justice, that is surrender. Let me be clear about something else. This was not a crusade. There was no vendetta. Prosecutors do not operate on emotion, at least they are not supposed to. They operate on evidence, standards, and obligations. When those standards are met, action follows. When they are not, it does not. That is the discipline of the role. The fact that the subject of these cases inspired devotion, anger, loyalty, and resentment does not alter the calculus. The law does not ask whether enforcing it will be easy. It asks whether it is necessary. We are living through a moment when many have decided that the Constitution is either a weapon or an obstacle, something to be wielded against opponents or bypassed when inconvenient. I reject that framing. The Constitution is neither shield nor sword. It is a structure, and structures fail when their load-bearing principles are ignored. If there is one thing I want people to understand, it is this: choosing not to act is also a choice, one with consequences just as real as action. Declining to enforce the law against powerful figures does not preserve stability. It teaches future leaders exactly how far they can go, and they will go farther. This moment was never about a single defendant. It was about a precedent, about whether power answers to law or law bends to power. History will render its judgment, not on the noise, not on the outrage, but on whether we were willing to defend the idea that no individual is indispensable and no office is untouchable. That idea is not radical, it is foundational, and it is worth defending, even when the cost is high. There is a temptation, especially in moments of political exhaustion, to declare the system irreparably broken and walk away from it altogether. I understand that impulse. When institutions fail repeatedly, cynicism feels rational. But cynicism is not reform, it is retreat. And retreat leaves the field open to those who understand power not as responsibility, but as entitlement. Much has been said about selective enforcement, about hypocrisy, about past abuses that went unpunished. Those criticisms are not baseless. History is filled with examples where power insulated itself from consequence. But acknowledging those failures does not justify repeating them. In fact, it imposes a greater obligation to correct them when the opportunity arises. The argument that accountability should wait for some imagined moment of perfect neutrality is, in practice, an argument for permanent delay. There is always an election approaching, always a geopolitical crisis unfolding, always a reason to postpone discomfort. And so the threshold for action is raised again and again until it becomes unreachable. That is how norms collapse, not with dramatic violations, but with quiet rationalizations. I have also heard the claim that the justice system has become a substitute for politics, that courts and prosecutors are now used to settle what should be decided at the ballot box. That concern deserves serious reflection. But it is being misapplied here. Elections determine who holds office, not whether laws exist. The ballot box is not a pardon power. It does not erase conduct or nullify statutes. If political success can extinguish legal exposure, then elections cease to be instruments of self-government and become shields against consequence. That is not democracy. It is something far closer to sanctioned impunity. There is another uncomfortable reality that rarely gets addressed honestly. Institutions are weakest precisely when they fear confrontation. When enforcement becomes tentative, conditional, or apologetic, it signals vulnerability. And vulnerability invites exploitation. Strong institutions are not those that avoid controversy. They are those that withstand it. I do not deny that our system grants enormous discretion to prosecutors. That discretion must be exercised carefully, transparently, and with humility. But discretion does not mean paralysis. It does not mean refusing to act because the subject is polarizing or the outcome uncertain. The presence of risk does not negate the presence of duty. Some have portrayed this moment as proof that the constitutional order itself has failed, that executive power has grown so vast, so insulated, that law can no longer meaningfully restrain it. That diagnosis may be partially correct, but if so, the solution cannot be surrender. If constitutional limits have eroded, the response must be to reinforce them, not declare them obsolete. It is fashionable to say that no one is above the law has always been a myth. Perhaps it has been imperfectly realized. But myths in the civic sense are aspirational truths, principles we strive toward even when we fall short. Abandoning them because they have been violated is not realism, it is abdication. The danger we face is not merely that powerful individuals evade accountability, it is that the public becomes convinced that accountability itself is illegitimate. When that happens, enforcement is reinterpreted as persecution, evidence as conspiracy, and law as theater. At that point, the distinction between justice and power dissolves. And once that distinction disappears, nothing replaces it except raw force, political, institutional, or otherwise. I am often asked whether the outcome was worth it, whether the political backlash, the division, the distrust were too high a price to pay. That question assumes that the alternative was cost-free. It was not. Choosing inaction would have exacted its own toll, quieter perhaps, but deeper. It would have confirmed that certain lines exist only on paper, that some actors operate under a different set of rules, that constitutional promises are negotiable. That message would have echoed far beyond a single case. There is a reason authoritarian systems obsess over loyalty rather than legality. Law constrains. Loyalty liberates power. When societies begin to value allegiance over accountability, they drift, slowly at first, then suddenly, toward something unrecognizable. This is not about personal vindication. History does not require vindication. It requires clarity. Years from now, the particulars will blur. What will remain is the question of whether institutions attempted to hold the line or quietly stepped aside. I do not claim perfection. No prosecution is flawless. No judgment is immune from criticism. But the existence of imperfection does not invalidate the enterprise. If it did, no law could ever be enforced, no precedent set, no boundary drawn. We are at an inflection point, not because of one individual, but because of what we are willing to normalize. Are we prepared to accept that certain figures are functionally untouchable, that political identity determines legal exposure, that institutional restraint must always yield to electoral calculation? Those are not abstract questions. They are choices being made implicitly and explicitly every day. The Constitution was never meant to be self-executing. It depends on people willing to incur cost in its defense, reputational, professional, even personal. When that willingness evaporates, the document becomes ceremonial, revered in language, ignored in practice. I did not enter public service expecting applause. Accountability rarely earns it, but I did expect resistance. That resistance is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that the work mattered. If we want a future where the law is something more than a rhetorical device, we must accept that enforcing it will sometimes be uncomfortable, destabilizing, and unpopular. The alternative is a system where outcomes are determined not by principle, but by leverage. And that system, once entrenched, does not correct itself. In the end, this moment will not be remembered for its noise, its outrage, or its spectacle. It will be remembered for whether the country chose to reinforce the idea that law constrains power, or conceded that power defines the law. That choice is not mine alone. It belongs to all of us, and it is still being made.